Welcome back. So the National Assembly and the NCOP sittings were concluded this week. MPs and Premiers have sworn in, and the government of national unity is getting ready to start with the business of the 7th administration. Professor Duvenhage, a political analyst from the Northwest University, is now joining us, looking at the composition of the NCOP and the caliber of leaders elected in the different legislatures. Prof, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. Just an overarching question before we go into what happened in the NCOP. Is it too early to ask who has lost and who has won, considering that negotiations are still underway around the executive positions that will be given by the president, and also the allocation of the chairmanships in the various portfolio committees in Parliament?
Good morning, Aldrin. Yes, I think it is a bit early to make a final assessment. We know that there's agreements behind the scenes, and we also know that the different parties are going to negotiate after this first appointments. But at this point in time, it seems like a relative solid cooperation among the role players. And here I'm referring to the ANC, the IFP, and the Democratic Alliance. There may be other partners coming into the play in the future, but as these three parties are concerned, I think it is a positive and constructive cooperation, and we have seen the play out of this in the National Assembly, as well as the appointment of the president and with regard to the NCOP.
Yeah, and that particular agreement and this working relationship, specifically between the members of the Government of National Unity, also playing out at the provincial level, looking at what has happened in Gauteng and what has happened in KwaZulu-Natal, where a lot of people were anticipating that the premier that will be elected is a premier that's going to come from the biggest political party, which is the MK party, but they lost it.
Yes, indeed. My understanding was that the strategy with regard to provinces was that the majority party can take the lead in the establishment of a coalition. So in the case of KZN, it should have been the MK party. It was the ANC with regard to Gauteng, but the MK party show an inability to consolidate support to achieve a majority. And it has a lot to do with the single vote or what of the National Freedom Party. And when the ANC, DA, IFP came in the position to get the support of the NFP as well, that swing the scale in their direction, and the end result was that the coalition took KZN. And that, I believe, is one of the main reasons why Mr. Zuma is going to address the nation on political developments during the day. And it will be very interesting to see which strategy he will follow. They boycotted the National Assembly meeting, and now they are basically in the cold. And I think it was a negative 2 days for both the MK party as well as the EFF.
Yeah, and what should we read into that statement that was issued by the MK party, the media advisory, that President Zuma will address the nation at a pivotal, as they call it, pivotal media conference regarding the current political situation and the ongoing developments in South Africa, covering a range of topics that are currently vital to the national discourse and the future trajectory of the nation. What should we read into that?
Well, my first take was that the strategy followed by the MK party, and basically I would like to take this back to the violence of 2021, is a very negative position. We have seen the policy framework of the MK party, basically an anti-system approach against aspects of the Constitution, against the principle of the rule of law, not accepting the outcome of an election that was, in fact, a very good election, free and fair, according to my assessment. And the result was that the MK party has lost their moral high ground. They are outmaneuvered and outpositioned in terms of South African politics, not only nationally, but also in their stronghold KZN. And I believe that President Zuma is going to react on this. And we know that for a past year or two, he told us that he's going to say a lot of things about the ANC, about corruption, misconduct, implicating leaders like Cyril Ramaphosa and others. It will be interesting to see if he's now going that route or if he's only going to reflect on the current situation. I believe that he's definitely going to focus on what I would call, from his perspective, the unholy alliance between the ANC and the Democratic Alliance, things like white monopoly capital, that type of line. And it's definitely going to be a radical approach. We have seen some of the resistance coming from the side of the EFF, but without success. We have seen Judge Zondo dealing with Floyd Shivambu in a thorough way. So in many ways, I think the 2 days was very positive for South African politics, as is reflected also in the markets. And I think it's a negative 2 days for the EFF and the MK party. Therefore, they need to follow another strategy to regain momentum and to consolidate their position.
Yeah, and also in the statement, once again, you speak about the 2021 violence. The MK party has come out to say that they do not condone any violence. The police have, though, increased the number of police officers deployed in KZN because of perhaps maybe anticipated violence, as well as what they say reaction to the outcomes of the elections. But in that statement, again, from the MK party, right at the bottom of that media advisory, they say that the media representatives are requested to arrive at least 30 minutes early to complete security checks. A Q&A session will follow with President Zuma. Will follow President Zuma's address. So they speak about the security checks. And when I saw that, I asked myself, so what does this mean? Is there any belief within the MK party itself that there could be people who are trying to undermine the peaceful address, perhaps maybe, that will be delivered by the MK party's president, or perhaps that they do anticipate that there could be something that go towards the side of violence, or could be seen as violence, or trying to undermine this address as well. I don't know, what do you read into it? Or are we just making a lot over something that is probably non-existent?
Well, just to make the connection to the 2021 violence in KZN and parts of Ekurhuleni, it is basically the same people that was behind the violence that is now institutionalizing themselves within the MK movement. So you can make the connection, but I'm positive if they distance themselves from the use of violence.
Which people are you speaking about, Prof?
Is, when it comes to politics, excuse me?
Which people are you speaking about that are linked to the violence or behind the violence?
I am speaking about the leadership behind the violence, thinking about the arrest of Jacob Zuma and then the unleashing of violence. I think the involvement of his daughter. There were more than, I think, 60 people identified within the context of that violence, and no action was taken against them. And they continue with their battle, and then they establish the MK party. But okay, let's give them credit and say they distance themselves from violence and look at the current situation. When it comes to politics, it is absolutely clear you need an enemy to justify yourself you must have an enemy, and you can define that enemy in many ways. I think at the moment, the enemy, the main enemy of the MK party is definitely the ANC. And therefore, they will have this security restrictions coming up. And they would like to give it a formal military appearance, a type of an MK security thing. It's part of the tradition and the culture. However, I think in the past we have heard the MK party saying that there are threats for their leadership, and in particular for Jacob Zuma. I think to a certain extent, taking the levels of conflict and violence and even assassinations in KZN, that is probably not impossible, but I think it's highly unlikely at the moment.
Okay, and that briefing coming up a bit later on today at around 2 o'clock later on this afternoon. Just quickly want to go back to the NCOP once again. One of the controversial bills that was passed in the NCOP quite recently, just before we went into the elections in December, was the NHI bill. And I wonder, when it comes to contentious bills like that nature, what that would mean for those bills being passed, considering that you have these differing ideological approaches to how, for instance, we ensure as a country that we give people access to quality healthcare.
Well, there's no doubt that there are a huge distance, ideologically speaking, between the ANC, coming from the ideology of what we call the National Democratic Revolutionary Idea and related transformational initiatives on the one side, and the liberal social democratic approach associated with the Democratic Alliance. But at the same time, we must think about the whole concept of a developmental state who is creating a bit of a middle ground between the position of the ANC and the DA. And if you read the declaration of intent in terms of the cooperation for a government of national unity, you will find central principles of the Constitution there, basically a connectivity to social justice, redress. I think there are common ground. Talking about the National Health Insurance Bill, and there are other bills, the Bella Bill, hate speech, and a few others. I think the DA will come into play asking for an amendment of that bill. And my understanding, and that was information we received behind the scenes, is that the ANC, to a certain extent, is pragmatically orientated to discuss the bill. At the moment, there will be court cases against some of these bills, national health insurance, without any doubt. And maybe after the court's assessment, we may see a reconsidering of the content of the bill, and maybe we may see some adjustments, because this will be very critical for both these parties, the DA and the ANC, to keep their face in an area that is controversial, where both parties had very, very strong views. But we know in purely practical terms, the national health insurance approach is not going to work. Be amended. On the other side, we know there's a need for a national health system for South Africa, or at least to improve. And I think there are room for a compromise in this regard.
And when we look at the appointment of the cabinet, so there's going to be the inauguration that's taking place on Wednesday. As we said, that negotiations are still underway between the various political parties around who will secure which position in the executive. Would the president have to take into consideration the political, ideological perspective of a political party member that is not an ANC member on whether or not to give them that particular, whichever particular ministry it is. City Press is reporting today that the DA could receive up to 7 cabinet positions, and they say that according to an ANC source, those positions or ministries include water and sanitation, energy, local government, and trade and industry. Like, for instance, the DA and the ANC don't agree on the approach around energy and how to ensure energy sustainability. Do you think that the president would have to take into consideration the political party's ideology when it comes to that particular ministry?
The ministries you are referring to are probably some of them less sensitive. I think if it comes to finances, if it comes to foreign affairs, internal affairs, these portfolios, safety, security, and maybe the intelligence portfolio, correctional services, these are very, very sensitive portfolios. But looking at things like, for example, energy, it is less sensitive, but it is not to say that there's not going to be huge conflict. What is also interesting, the portfolios you are referring to is currently facing major challenges.
Yeah.
Thinking about the state of local government, we know what's going on with regard to energy and some of the other portfolios. So it's going to be challenging for a new minister to function within that particular environment. But yes, I think the president would take that into consideration. And we must say this is government of national unity. So we expect the reality of differences, but also the need to get some form of a compromise going. We must also take into consideration that the ANC only received 40.2% of the support in the country.
Yeah.
In terms of eligible voters, you're going down to a percentage of about 17%. Now, you need to accommodate, you cannot get your own way all the time. So there need to be compromises, and I think that is going to be the reality of action